Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Danny Dorling.
Thank you ever so much for that. Thank you for the invite. The good news is I'm only going to speak for 30 minutes at most. We're going to get some slides up in a minute. Billionaires are the new aristocracy. So most of you probably recognise at least one person in that picture. They're a celebrity aristocracy. It's interesting that they're glued to their phones, as others are. This photograph was taken at the inauguration of Donald Trump when 5 of the 7 richest people in the world were standing behind him, kind of not making it very subtle what was going on. There was a project, it's published, Project 2025. It's largely gone to plan of the people who were invested in it, who funded it. Vicky will say more about what's wrong. Roger's the expert on the nastiest of the billionaires. I'm going to give you a different kind of message, I think. A more optimistic one. Because I'm not as worried about the billionaires as most people are. I could be wrong, we certainly should be worried about them. But I think the world is ready for the billionaires. That we've been preparing for them. We can see what they do. More needs to be said or exposed about them. But as far as I'm aware, almost nobody supports the idea of a billionaire. I haven't seen a single social scientist who's written the world is made a better place when somebody has the personal wealth of 1 billion or 10 billion or 100 billion or 200 billion. There are lots of arguments about wealth lines. The best research is done in the Netherlands. Should we start to tax people when they have a personal wealth of 2 million? Just 2 million? Okay. 2% of a billionaire, or maybe 10 million. Where should the wealth line be? In the city of Bristol, I can tell you where on Cabot Hill and up down the Downs, the folk are who might have 10 million or so. When I was a PhD student in the 80s, I was given 280 magnetic tapes with the entire share registry of Britain on them. And it took some poor souls all night to mount the tapes onto the mainframe and take them off again, so that I could compact the data and actually look who had the wealth of it. Share registry was public, it was typed in Mongolian. And what I discovered, I was a PhD student up in Newcastle, is that half of the wealth of Newcastle was held by people who lived in some big houses around Town Moor in the centre. Wealth's always been incredibly concentrated. There's the blurb for the talk. That's the largest amount of text you're going to get tonight. You're going to get some graphs as well as that. And the source is the Independent newspaper. On the plan, really early on, not going to plan. This story is March. March, April, May, June. You can have all kinds of conspiracy theories. You could think, was that little tough tiff staged? Are they really, really clever and they're pretending to be really stupid, and actually they're super geniuses who are really good at pretending to be really stupid? Or are they actually really stupid? And then you have to worry about us, of course, because are we capable of managing our world so badly that we get into a position where these men, almost all men, have such immense power? Musk could have the UK right now, and it's slightly worrying if he's bored of the USA or not getting on with Donald. When Donald talked about wanting Mexico or Canada or Greenland, they weren't really his priorities. The priority is always for the US far right, the megalomaniacs, the billionaires. The priority outside the USA has always been London and in England. That's where they funded the think tanks, that's where the Tufton Street Mafia are. The cash comes from the USA. The second capital for the billionaires in Europe is Warsaw, where there is a mini Adam Smith Institute, right? But the bridgehead is London for them. So I'm not being overly dismissive. If Elon Musk at the moment decides he wants to have Britain, we do not have the laws in place to stop him flooding the country with funding for reform or whatever else. A few months ago, Elon's people, I presume he hasn't got that much time himself, expressed dislike with how Nigel Farage was doing. The implication being that really they needed a slightly more charismatic, less beer-toking, kind of far-right leader. But it goes on and on. So I'm serious about this. The biggest threat in this country, the real enemy within, is the rich and the super rich and the rich abroad. That is what will secure a set of MPs who may not wish there to be an election ahead. Right? But that's the end of my doom mongering. I'm now going to get more positive. Some of the graphs I'm going to show you come from this book, which was published a few days ago, called The Next Crisis, and one of the crises is what happens when the men with money get so much money and so much power. That graph is showing you the falling proportion of wealth, not income but wealth, held by the richest 1% in the USA and UK, Sweden and France since 1895. And you'll see that the rise that there's been since the 1980s is much smaller than the fall. The rich of these countries have not got themselves back at all to anywhere like the position they were in the past. The little inset shows what happens if you take the UK line, just show a few years to extend the scale. Okay? And it's a bit like framing. You know, if you want to scare people in the UK about the concentration of wealth, just go from the 1980s to now, where the best off 1% see their take rise from about 15% to about 25% and then down a bit. And we can say, oh look, the wealthier are getting wealthier and wealthier. Zoom out at the long picture, and the wealthiest 1% are no longer in the position that they were at the time of our grandparents, great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. So what's happened? The key thing that's happened with wealth distribution is that progressively over decades, the proportion of people doing well has got smaller and smaller and smaller. Margaret Thatcher's government managed to increase the wealth of about a quarter of the population. So you voted for in 1979, you voted for in 83 and in 87. And on average, your family would get better off. Your house price for the house you managed to secure would go up. You would leave your children, in theory, more. That was the last time that happened. The best off 10%, you take about 40% of all income, are mostly struggling. Many of you are in that group. They're worrying how they're going to help their children get a mortgage. Their children are in their 40s. Once you begin to look in the best of 1%, when I was asked a few years ago by some pretty wealthy people how much you needed to get into 1%, I said then it was 120,000 a year, and one of them, the mother, said to me, oh, that can't be right, because our 2 children earn more than that, and we're having to help them pay for the mortgage for 3-bed houses in Fulham. So the bottom end of the 1% doesn't necessarily get you a 3-bed house in Fulham. If you want to know precisely where the bottom end of the 1% is in the UK, it was Rishi Sunak. Rishi grew up with a GP father and a mother running a pharmacy to which presumably the father and his colleagues directed the patients. 200 fund-holding pharmacy-related GPs just about made it into the 1% back then. If you're 50 with the money, if you save, if you get little Rishi to do the books, as he did, you can just about get the boy into that particular public school, but you are at the very bottom of the 1%. Rishi Sunak is really useful because he epitomises the whole thing, because he went off to the right university to do his masters and met a woman at the very top of the 1%. A woman, Rishi's wife, whose income from her wealth was more 2 years ago than the entire income of all Labour MPs in the House of Parliament, just by doing nothing. That's an idea of the top end. I'm going to move forward so you can look at another graph for those who like looking. I'll explain it in a minute, but I want to describe my scepticism. Many years ago, there was an Oxfam report which managed to crash the servers at Oxfam. The report was the first time that Oxfam produced its famous how many billionaires would fit in a bus and have half the world's wealth report, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The report was put out at the time of Davos. It completely beat all the PR that was coming out of Davos. This shock horror, the world's billionaires, less than the number you need to fit into a double-decker bus, have half the world's wealth. Isn't it terrible? Now here's the good news. Every year since then, Oxfam have produced a similar report. Every year then, it has talked about how terrible the situation is. And it is terrible. But every year then, if somebody wants to do a PhD on this, they can. The precise statistic that Oxfam quotes has been altered so that it can always be terrible, because in some ways the situation isn't as bad as when Oxfam first did it. Partly because it's only the very best of half of the billionaires on the bus that have actually done well. The others have not done so well. If you think about the UK, about us, the Sunday Times Rich list used to include 1,000 families. And then a few years ago they dropped 750 of the families just at the point that their wealth wasn't going up that much, to concentrate on 250. We're seeing this cascading away at the top. So you end up with a few absolute winners. But you don't end up with a coalition of the wealthy you used to have. We don't have a set of 1,000 people in Britain who are really very, very, very wealthy. It's smaller than that. And half of them are not necessarily that much from Britain. It's just a convenient place, London, in the majority of cases, to park themselves in a country that respects property as much as we do. Hence they think their money is safe. This gives me optimism. It would be far more dangerous if the wealth was spread out. These graphs are about the basket case in the United States. The first one is showing you how much more likely you are to die if you're any given age in the US as opposed to richer families. On average, by the time you're 30, you're 4 times more likely to die that year if you live in the USA. It's a disaster. It's not until you get into your late 90s, on average, that you're approaching the rates. And the rates, of course, are very high. John Byrne Murdoch produced this middle graph. Each dot is a percentile of the population. The best off 1% in the USA, despite spending the most on healthcare in the world on themselves, are not living hardly any weeks longer than the best off 1% in the UK or in England. And the best off in England are not living as long as in most of Europe, because they live longer in Europe because they have higher life expectancy. All that attention, all those private doctors, the rich are not actually doing that well. There are terrible inequalities in health. But it would be much worse if having that much money actually meant you might live happily to 150 or 200 years Right? That isn't the case at all. The third graph just compares countries, also shows how bad the coronavirus pandemic was in the United States. The other two countries in the world that were large and as bad as the US or worse, Russia, 4-year life expectancy drop. Only 1 year was COVID, 3 years was mismanagement. You need a distraction when you do that. Invade a country. And India, 4 years drop in life expectancy. And the Modi. Billionaires, multi-millionaires, bad news. This is a map of the world shaped by everybody who's been killed in wars since 1989 until a year or so ago. So if you want to know the most extreme victims of wealth, these wars occur because people sell weapons. People go to war, there's a military-industrial complex. The victims of wealth are in poor countries, mainly Muslim countries, and Rwanda. That's who has suffered the most from the most profitable industry in the world, which they're currently getting European countries to ramp up their spending on this. Okay? There are many, many dangers of which. One of which is how much they like selling us weapons at exorbitant prices and hoping we use them so that we buy some more. But it looks like a crusade when you look at that map. And you actually look at who's been dying the most. And the majority of those wars are not caused by the people in those places. So I'm not sanguine about the danger, but it is the danger of allowing people to make enormous profits. We have controlled it to an extent that we haven't had another world war. But these are the kind of fears if we allow the current situation to continue. This is income. And we're going to go on a bit about the UK, and we're going to show you some equivalent pictures to the pictures of the billionaires in a minute. I'm only going to worry about the top line. The top line is the best off 1% of the 1%, 1 in 10,000 people. Just over a century ago, they had over 400 times average income. Imagine you're paying the servants half average income. You've got 400 times average. You could spend half your income a year on servants and have 400 servants. And that's a country house. That's the kind of inequalities we used to have before they came down and down and down and down. Once you say that this is no longer decent, once you begin to cast doubt on the idea that God has ordained a set of people to be this wealthy, and it's for the goodness of us all that they are, once the investments on their wealth stop returning, and I'll give you an example in a minute of that, the fall carries on and on and on. Once you tax the wealth, once you bring an inheritance tax to pay for your wars, then the houses are donated to the National Trust. We have all kinds of face-saving ways to get down to the bottom. The scale is a log scale, by the way, because the fall of the wealth of the wealthy was so precipitous, you can't fit it on a normal graph. And then it's gone up again, but it's a log scale. So it's still about 10 times less than where it was. As a group, the 1% and the 1% in the UK have not got back at all to where they were a century ago. A century ago, the most common job for women was to work in service. Because what you need if you're rich are people doing things for you. If you look at maps of wealth in the UK, wherever there's a wealthy area, within a very short distance is a poor area. Because there's no point being very wealthy if you've got to clean your own home, cook your own food, and look after your own children, wash your own car, and so on. Okay, my equivalent picture for the billionaires now. From a TV adaptation, and not the original adaptation. This is Ryder and Lady Marchmont. My favourite book about the fall of the rich, right here we visit it. There are other books available. An Inspector Calls is very good, but kind of left-wing and a bit kind of preachy. You know, all across Europe is going to be burning and fire and so on. Rising New Vistas was written by a conservative, partly lamenting the change that was occurring. Lady Marchmont, trying to hold it all together, was concerned that she wouldn't be able to keep Brideshead going because the money was no longer coming in. The money was coming in from the plantations that she owned. It was the end of those empire investments. Thomas Piketty and a colleague published a paper, I think yesterday, just showing how different the distribution of wealth in the world would be without that inequality between Europe and the West, just yesterday. Here's another picture of Lady Marchmont. And I just want you to recognise it. It's her, and of course mostly men, that is the 1% and the 1%. And if I'd stood before you, I don't even think this place was built. Was it 1920s?
100 years to yesterday.
100 years yesterday when they put the breeze blocks up. You do know the breeze block construction is fake. Anyway, very nice. 100 years yesterday. But, you know, why built 100 years yesterday? Because the beginnings of the spreading of the wealth a bit. Of course it was the forced slaving families, whatever, and let's not get into trouble about it. Really nice that this university has changed one part of its crest. Really good. Yeah. Must be the most expensive branding redesign ever for these defend. But, you know, they built this. And support the university and a bit of the spreading of the wealth. Yeah. Which carries on and on and on. You know, finally we get to the point where massive attack can play in that hall again. Yeah? We're getting there slowly. What are the billionaires up against? In a way, the aristocrats, and I've got just a few minutes to go, so I'm going to zoom through the rest. The aristocrats were up against the changing world order, the ending of empire, the independence of colonies, the rise of trade unions, the rising position of women, revolution in the world, making you really scared of what was happening. So you build a nice thing for Bristol, hoping that they're not going to come up with pitchforks. You wouldn't believe how scared the rich are with pitchforks, by the way. They can't understand why you don't go for their money. They're up against emissions. They're up against a world in which you can't carry on doing this kind of thing. This is the emissions just looked at another way as they rise and rise and rise. They try to tell you, don't worry. We will find a way of colonising another planet. One we'll colonise only with white people, by the way, I assume. And it doesn't matter if we wreck this one, there's a whole solar system out there. And it's very kind of reminiscent of End of Empire. They're up against population change. That's your standard population graph. But this is how it's actually changing. The youngest person in this room is going to be alive at the point when world population actually falls. This graph is 6 years out of date. The UN have updated it 3 times since then. In the year 2084, our global population goes down. Already we're a long way past the true peak baby, which was 1990 then, had a peak slightly higher of their own children. The number of young people in the world that you can exploit is going down and down and down and down. The Legal Parasites poster is one of these many. We're getting another rise in some very ingenious people putting up posters on bus stops. It takes some time to realise they're not real. My preference, I'm not going to show it, is the ones about David Lammy are hilarious. And there's the world population graph shown another way, showing you the most momentous things that occurred. Was turning up in the Americas with our measles, that's 1492, if you see the blip in the graph, 60 million dead. Colonisation and empire, that's the mid-1800s. And the rising position of power of women, saying they don't want to have as many babies and putting men in their box. Which outside of the United States, where 2% of the world's population live with a female are losing rights, women are gaining rights in most of the rest of the world. We highlight the places they're not, we highlight the right with men trying to stop them, but they're rising. I made these slides at least a week ago. I wasn't aware. Does anybody know whether Greta's got home yet? She was arrested, I think, yesterday. But she got home?
France.
She's on the way, okay. But it is kind of like the Greta's versus, right, the school children. In a global narrative of where we're going. Too many graphs and so on, but if any of you thought that having very rich people was good, this is public spending in the UK. We're at the bottom of the list. So I've got your attention for another minute or so. You can quickly read how bad we are. We celebrate wealth. We celebrate... Our billionaires are quite funny. They're not billionaires even in most cases. People who design a slightly better hand dryer in the toilets and then take the factory hours, wherever it was, near Somerset, and move it. The result of the celebration of wealth in the UK is to get us to a position where the poor is fifth, where people are worse off than the poor is fifth in most of Eastern Europe. So we're a prime target for what's happening in the USA. And we're doing badly. The complicated graph there is United Nations' latest estimates of changes in childhood poverty. It's a change over 7 years, 2014 to 2021. It's really good news. Poland, Slovenia, Latvia, Lithuania, Korea. If you think about Parasite and Squid Games, you can have a very unequal country and good things happen to it even before you depose somebody acting anti-democratically. Estonia, Canada, Romania, Portugal, Croatia, Japan, Ireland, Malta, Greece, Belgium, Czechia, New Zealand, Bulgaria, even Chile. 30-20% drops in child poverty in 7 years. There's enormous amounts of good news in the world. You're in the wrong country in Europe. I can tell because if you've got very good eyesight, the red bar at the top is United Kingdom. And we're already bad before we had that huge rise in child poverty. The countries just beneath are Iceland, France, Switzerland and Norway, which have had a small 10% rise from the lowest levels humanity has ever achieved. Inequalities are falling. The other graph is showing, if you look, when people tell you that inequality is rising everywhere, it isn't. It's falling in more places than it's rising. It's a bit like people telling you that the far right are always on the rise. If that had been true for the last 30 years, we'd all be used to stepping by now. Groups like Golden Dawn suddenly do really well and quite terrifyingly, and then they're confronted. I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to skip over conspiracy theories just to get you towards the end. Look at them. They're not sleek. They're not charismatic. If they've got PR teams, which you'd have thought they'd have got, their PR teams cannot wrestle the mobile phones off them. There have been analysis done of their tweets. They really do tweet themselves. I mean, how stupid do you... if I had not much more money, apart from the fact I'm highly dyslexic, but also I like a drink, I would not let anybody else, I would not be tweeting myself. It's a really stupid thing to do if you want to look good. But they really are. Textual analysis has shown that they are. You can see which phone they're using at the time. It's quite remarkable that out of the diversity of human beings we have, because we do have some human beings who are kind of unusually weird, a bit clever, charismatic, it's quite remarkable that the folk who've ended up at the top aren't so amazingly inane in ability, personal life, relationships with each other. And it's good news. It would be dangerous if they were kind of like George Clooney-like. Just one partner, 2 kids, selling coffee and selling you the idea that inequality is good for you. But they're not. Here's my last slide, because I always put this up. Ever since it was recommended to prevent at one school telling the dangerous to Jones children. And the reason I put this up is I think we have a very, very long battle, which you can trace back centuries, to trying to control, first of all, the supposed divine right of kings, and then just winning a weekend, having strikes, trying to get rights. Very recently, I think we won the 3-day weekend. Any of you have noticed? Does anybody go to work on Friday anymore? Anyway. This was the 10 Commandments of the Socialist Sunday School movement a century ago. The banner was produced just before the First World War, which makes the poppies, which I noticed are growing all around this university, quite poignant. But if you read the 10 Commandments, they now just read as absolute common sense. And of course you'd be like that. Right? Progressive politics tends to win. Things go wrong. We have to address them. We don't know how we're going to address the billionaires, but the great thing is there are very, very few of them. And they might annoy you, but they also annoy people much, much better off than you by what they're doing. They're concentrated in just a few countries. They're not being allowed to behave in this way in many parts of the world. And I'll end with, because I managed to get away with it on the BBC on Monday, there's a country in the world which doesn't let them play with their software, which is China. It is entirely possible to completely ban this software, which is collecting all your data when you send your personal private messages on WhatsApp to your loved one for nothing. Right? It is perfectly possible to say that's not tolerable. It would be wonderful if the EU could get its act together and start to control Amazon. Ideally, just simply nationalise it makes sense. Control Facebook, control X, declare them all publishers, hold them legally liable for what they do. That may sound like a pipe dream to you, but just think what we did with the aristocracy. If you have a look at the moment and see how many dukes are left, they're absolutely no good at breeding. We are running out of dukes in this country, and they used to control it. Thank you very much for your patience.
I'm just going to stay here, I think.
Thank you very much, Danny, for that insightful talk. Did I scare you?
That's microphone.
Great. So, we are now going to hear brief responses from two leading scholars who bring rich expertise in different but really connected areas of social harm and injustice. First, we will have Professor Roger Burrows from the School for Policy Studies, University of Bristol. So Roger's research explores social inequality, class, and the effects of financialization and urban change. And Roger's responses will be followed by Professor Vicky Canning from Lancaster University, whose work focuses on borders harm. So welcome back to Bristol as well, Vicky, who used to work with us at the School for Policy Studies. Roger, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay if I project? Okay, I'm a bit more pessimistic. Danny, I'm going to talk about a man who wasn't in that photo, but for me he's the man with a plan. That's someone called Peter Thiel. Anyone come across Peter Thiel? If you haven't heard of him, you will have heard of him by the end of this session. Peter Thiel is a billionaire, libertarian funder of an organisation called Neo-Reaction, the NRX. He made his money from PayPal, an early investor in Facebook, and is now the owner of a company called Palantir that has just won a multi-billion-pound contract with the NHS, run by someone called Karp, who had a PhD with Habermas, I saw the other day. The picture on the left is a picture of me in New Zealand, outside, or on the right, a picture of me in New Zealand outside of one of Peter Thiel's houses. This is his stealth house in Queenstown. And if you want a good read, I'd really, really recommend Eleanor Captain's new book, Bird and Wood, which is a fictionalised account of Peter Thiel-like characters' attempt to build a bunker and to do other things in the South Island of New Zealand. Why am I talking about Peter Thiel? Well, because I think he represents a new species of billionaire, a strategic, theoretically informed person with a background in a certain type of philosophy and law, and he is a man with a plan. He knows the other lot are buffoons. I was reading his biography just the other day, and things could have been very, very different, because his then dear friend Elon Musk, when they were just young things, just tiny little billionaires, Elon managed to turn a car over with Peter Thiel in it, and they both walked away safely. The world could have been a very, very different place if that had not happened. Now, for me, it's important that Peter Thiel was not one of those people standing behind Trump, because he is a man with a plan. He made a mistake in Trump 1.0. He was in the Oval Office. He thought he could get inside there and begin to get his own appointees, and that failed. He's now in the background and he's functioning strategically. But, people make their own history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing, someone once said. And that's certainly the case. And we need to understand the circumstances that people like Peter Thiel and the billionaires confront. They're not free agents. But as Danny has detailed in his statistics, we do confront a new set of global circumstances. And if I could just use the work of Piketty and his colleagues just for one moment, there is a very, very clear thesis about what's happening globally. It's a very simple thesis. It's that rates of return on capital, rates of return on assets, are higher than rates of return on wages and salaries. And under the history of capitalism, that's always been the case, except for one very, very short period of 80 or 90 years in the 20th century. The period when the social sciences came to fruition, where welfare states were created, and we imagined that was how things were going to be. But we have returned to a period very, very similar to that before the First World War, where rates of return on capital are running at 2 or 3 times higher rates of return on wages and salaries. It was only during that short 20th century period, when we had 2 world wars, the formation of the welfare state, the growth of the trade unions, that collective organisations were able to push up returns on wages and salaries to a rate that was higher than returns on assets. And some of the details that you have just been describing were a function of that. We have now, post-89 onwards, really, at an accelerating rate, seen returns on assets at a much greater level than returns on wages and salaries. Now, assets have spread, home ownership has spread, but assets are still concentrated amongst the very wealthy. Hence, and this is my favourite graph, this is the famous Piketty et al. Elephant graph, because it really looks like an elephant with its head and its trunk going up in the air. And what it shows is that over, say, 35-year period, 1995 to 2021, this particular variant of the graph shows how incomes have grown across the whole global distribution of incomes. And it's a good story. Incomes have increased, real incomes have increased for everybody, but they haven't increased uniformly at the same rate. If that was the case, it would be a straight line. The very poorest have indeed seen their rates of income increasing at a faster rate than those of us in the global north. And that says something about our relative position within that, just thinking back to people like Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson's book. Our incomes have increased, but not at such a faster rate as the bottom 50%, with one exception. Those at the very top of the income distribution. And as we've already hinted at, their income has increased literally exponentially. And that's not new. But if I could kind of counter the slowdown thesis, this is an example of kind of acceleration. It's an example of a greater and greater concentration, and I agree, Danny, with a smaller and smaller and smaller group of people who are seeing wealth. It's unimaginable. And just going to read you this quote from someone who's not always that popular, George Monbiot. But it does kind of summarise, I think, the situation we find ourselves in, the situation that people like Peter Thiel find themselves in. This is a quote from Trump first time round, the day after Johnson had become Prime Minister, I think. And this was a quote from George Monbiot in The Guardian. The ultra-rich are benefiting from disaster capitalism as institutions, rules and democratic oversight implode. Everywhere, equals the killer clowns are taken over. Johnson, Farage, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, Scott Morrison, just been given a bloody award in Australia, I saw. Can you believe that? And so on and so forth, Orban, and a host of other ludicrous strongmen dominate nations that would once have laughed them off stage. How's that happened? How have these ludicrous, misogynistic, racist idiots taken over? What's happened? They seek the deconstruction of the administrative state. Chaos is the profit multiplier for the disaster capitalism on which the new billionaires thrive. Every rupture is used to seize more assets. As institutional rules and democratic oversight implode, the oligarchs extend their wealth and power at our expense. At the same time, the killer clowns offer the oligarchs something else too: distraction and deflection. While they fleece us, we are urged to look elsewhere. We are mesmerised by buffoons who encourage us to channel the anger that should be preserved for billionaires towards imaginary enemies and customary scapegoats. Refugees, asylum seekers. That's the context. That's the structural context in which we find ourselves. Increasing concentrations of wealth amongst a smaller and smaller and smaller group of people. And they have a plan. And this isn't a conspiracy theory, I hope, but they have an ideology, a set of beliefs. And it's really interesting in the last few months since Trump came to power, and especially since J.D. Vance became vice president, things that we've been writing about for a decade suddenly seem like news to people. Nobody knew who the NRX were. No one knew what the ideology of the NRX represented. Well, Peter Thiel and a number of others have been some of the main funders of prototyping NRX ideas. Billionaire ideology investors in prototypes premised upon an idea, a thesis about the future. Now, I won't go in detail because I've only got 15 minutes or so to talk, but some of the characters hopefully you will have come across. Peter Thiel is your main man. He's a background in philosophy and law, big investor, but that's his role. He's a curator. His philosopher, if I can call him that, his house philosopher, Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Mulbug, front page of the New Yorker last week, suddenly in the popular mainstream media. The guy's a fascist. He's a fascist. A popular fascist. Somehow being accepted. Nick Land, Deleuzian theorist, cultural theorist who translated into sort of cultural theory lots of Yarvin's ideas in a text called The Dark Enlightenment. Patrick Friedman, part of the Friedman dynasty. His father was David Friedman, his grandfather was Milton Friedman, part of that libertarian tradition. Also received money from Thiel to establish something called the Seasteading Institute. Another prototype for this libertarian future. There's a plan. And this is the plan. This is what they dislike, and this is what they like. And we are at the very heart of it in the academy. What they don't like is democracy. It's an anti-democratic movement. Democracy regulates things. It slows things down. We want markets. We want speed. We want acceleration. They want to rage. They want to retire all government employees, otherwise known as Doge. And they don't want a democratic leader. They want a country, a state, a city run by a business person, by a CEO, or even a monarch, a king or a queen. But my God, no democracy. Democracy slows us down. It's too sluggish. We need to run things in a more business-like fashion. Also, equality. It's a myth. It's all about genetics. It's all about race science. We are, in this academy, what they would call blue pillars. Our job is to point out and to try and develop policies that try and prevent the worst excesses of accelerationist, uncompensated capitalism. We believe in equality, in democracy, in justice, not in the free working out of uncompensated capitalism. They believe in human biodiversity, what Nick Lang calls hyper-racism. They're racists. I was going to say they're white supremacists, but they're not just white supremacists. They have a hierarchy of worth in terms of what they believe the genetic value of people is. And thirdly, and we're kind of sitting in it, they're against the cathedral. They're against the blue pillars. They're against universities. This is what the culture war is all about. This is what the attack on Harvard is about. Equality, democracy. You're the enemy. You're going to be removed. You are blue pillars. You're slowing us down. Because what we want to do three things. We want to get rid of democracy, and we want to prioritise architectures of exit. We want there to be a system of governance for which there is competition. We want you to live in seasteads or in modules or online such that you can be a consumer for governance. None of this democracy stuff. What will win out will be a battle between the mechanisms of exit. To use the old Persian exit voice loyalty distinction, it's all about exit, there's nothing about voice. So we try and encourage new patchwork state forms. If any of you have read the novel Snow Crash, it's kind of laid out there almost perfectly in terms of what is envisaged. Seasteading, city-states, gated community, off-world communities. The work of Quinn Slobodian just recently has been trying to look at the development of all of these new non-democratic clusters, these free states, these cities. Thirdly, they believe in the singularity. They fund artificial intelligence. They will the merger of technology with humanity. They don't like regulation. They don't like the regulation of biosciences because it prevents these developments. AI, automation, posthumanism is what they are interested in. They're not trying to hide it. They're talking about it. They're talking about going to the moon. They're talking about putting things in people's heads. And they have models. They had Hong Kong, they had Singapore. They talk about neo-China. Technologically advanced, non-democratic, autocratic spaces. And the philosophy that they read is not philosophy that we read. Indeed, you can't even get access to some of the books that they read. We're trying to excavate Peter Thiel's influences, and they're not influences that we are familiar with. They're not influences that even the neoliberals or the libertarians necessarily are interested in. There's a whole bunch of people who are essentially fascist historians, fascist philosophers, Spengler, Schmidt, Strauss. He's absolutely obsessed with René Girard as well in terms of this notion of memetics. But the book he goes to for inspiration, as do many of these people, is a book published in 1997 called The Sovereign Individual. The Sovereign Individual, authored by James Dale Davidson and someone called Lord William Rees-Mogg. The editor at one time of the Times, and the father of a certain Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, The Sovereign Individual is a very, very, very odd book. Not read by social scientists, it quotes social scientists, written for the investor class in 1997, the third of a trilogy of books. Blood on the Streets, The Great Reckoning, and The Sovereign Individual Reloaded. It's not a book, as Alistair Campbell said when he read it, of prediction. It's a bloody blueprint. It gives guidance to where to invest, what's going to happen. And so far, it's got about 80% of things correct. A couple of books, if you want to follow this up, there's two books by Quinn Slobodian, Crack Up Capitalism, and the new one, Hayek's Bastards. The Sovereign Individual is in its second edition with a preface by Peter Thiel. If you want to know what the plan is, go and see the plan. If you want to know where the money's going, the money is going into prototypical investments in AI, in new technology, in architectures of exit. It's been done in plain sight. It's been done in plain sight, and that's why I'm less pessimistic. Why I'm more pessimistic. I think there's a strategy here, and it's a politically hybridic strategy that we haven't really got a grasp on, and we don't really have a handle on the dynamics that are occurring there. And the other reason I'm pessimistic, and this is my last slide, is because the technologies that they invest in and the technologies that come to structure our everyday lives and the lives of our children are the technologies they own. It's not just Palantir, it's OpenAI. It's about the very technologies that are now coming to the very centre of the academy. And those technologies are not neutral. They're instantiated with ideology. They're written by, they're funded by neo-reactionaries. And this is just a clip, and it's a very, very crude clip from an Adam Curtis documentary, which kind of makes the point, really, I suppose. It's a photo of the inside of Siena Cathedral. And then it's the inside of Siena Cathedral as seen by an AI that's been trained on dog faces. Now, the AI that we're using has been written by and has been trained on all manner of stuff. It's not neutral. They own it, and they own your data. Palantir is going to own your health records and your bio records. So they're a particular fraction of capital. And I'm going to end, and this is, I mean this quite seriously. I've been very kind of perplexed by the lack of state theory in recent years. Now, there used to be the idea, and I don't know how familiar you are with this, in something way back in the day, in the 1960s and 1970s, called the Miliband-Palancis debate, it was called, about the nature of the state. Ralph Miliband, the father of the Miliband brothers, who seemed to think it was all about who elites knew and who they went to school with, and if only we could capture the state, we would have a big impact. And Palancis, who was an Althusserian structuralist, came along and said, no. It doesn't matter who these people are. This is kind of machining. It's a kind of a structure imbalance. We need to understand the structures. And the role of the state, he says, the role of the state is to be what he calls relatively autonomous. Relatively autonomous from different fractions of capital. Because the role of the state is always to act in the interest of capital, but the interest of capital in general, in the long run. Now, my thesis, this is not an original thesis, is that the state's no longer relatively autonomous. It's been captured. It's been captured by a particular fraction of capital. Industrial capital is pissed off. Other forms of petty bourgeois capital is pissed off. It's been captured by Blackstone capital. Let me call it that. Billionaire, funder, Thiel, Musk, Zuckerberg capital. They've captured the state. They're in the state. The state's acting in the interest of that particular fraction of capital. And it's going to be a disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger, for that insightful talk. Now we'll hear from Professor Vicky Canning. Over to you, Vicky.
I'm actually not very good with technology, so I'm actually going to just get up some. So our role is as discussants. So I was actually just going to pick up on some of the points that Danny made, and I briefly read through parts of the book yesterday that you'd sent on the next crisis. But drawing from what Roger and both Danny have said, I'd actually like to draw in a little bit more in relation to the key points that were made toward the end there in terms of the autonomous state. So I am a semiologist. I research, kind of an anti-criminologist in a way, where I research social harms and often harms that go unseen and unhidden. So semiology is the study of social harm. So I'm interested in the micro-level impacts and implications of the socio-economic and political decisions that are made at these kind of macro levels. We know as well, so just to kind of draw it out there in relation to the state, I'm co-chair at Statewatch EU, and I highly recommend, if you're not familiar with the work of the researchers there, to take a look through a lot of so we've got online archives, but constantly updated research in relation to AI, in relation to biometrics. My main interest is in migration, and I work, for those of you who don't know me, as Nazma said, I did used to work here, but for those of you who don't know me, I work in relation to migration, immigration detention research, and the impact, the harms of immigration detention, and harms of borders as well as torture. So when you're talking about democracy, I think one thing that's kind of interesting there, in a lot of the work that I've done in interviewing practitioners working with survivors of torture and with working with survivors of torture and torturous violence myself, and drawn from the work of people like Darius Rajali, is that we know that torture follows democracy. And a lot of these things are interrelated. So in a way, I kind of want to think about the structural and the international, but bring that down to what you mentioned there, which is the victims of wealth. I think that's a really key term there, because the victims of wealth are those who actually, I'd imagine, don't have much time to spend worrying about who a billionaire is, or whether these graphs have any bearing on reality of how one person lives in comparison to another person's temporal being and existence. And sort of drawn from reading on Danny's book there on the next crisis. One thing I think is interesting that we often move away from is, well, two things. One is civil liberties, and the way in which we also sell civil liberties for quite individualised means, I think. But the other is the ways in which the interconnections between the interests of the wealthy relate to the everydays of those who are most impacted by a lack of real life freedom. So in Danny's new book, he mentions, if we cannot eat, how can we be free? I think these are questions that are actually really asked about people that don't have time to worry about who billionaires are or how wealth goes up or down for them, but things in the everyday, that constant consciousness of when next meals are coming, when being able, and I'm thinking about as well people who've been in immigration detention or who are in asylum centres and deportation centres, where autonomy over time, temporality over thinking about futures is all removed. And I think these ideas, I'm going to just show some kind of things. So to give it a bit of context, we actually had a full day today of masterclass stuff with the PGRs. Some of them are here. And we were talking a lot about accountability, a lack thereof, whether or not these decisions are deliberate. So I think that we need to sort of, in acknowledging that states are not monolithic, that shift to the state corporate and the deliberate decisions that are taken that will result in structural violence and, as we discussed today, from the perspective of Frederick Engels, social murder. And one thing we don't see in relation to the decisions of those who are richest, or the investments as well, something that we kind of forget about is the investments into shares, investments into corporations, which inflict deep harms on those at the sharp ends of them. And I would say that in relation to imprisonment, in immigration detention, in terms of who makes money from, so I'm thinking back to work Monish Bhatia and I did on misery as business, and starting to think about how those harms are actually felt and the relationship between that and the lack of accountability at the top. So I just wanted to pull up something, if I can. As I say, I'm terrible for technology. But that people may or may not be familiar with. But as I said, I was actually just going to talk to Danny's thing, but now that Roger's got us started, I might as well get going. And I want to relate it back as well to sort of Danny's points of, that we're in a state of we're in a space built on slavery, and we are and that's often sold as philanthropy. And also we're in universities, so one thing I want to get to particularly toward the end is the role of people within universities and working beyond universities as well to address these harms and problems. Because, I'll get to my problems with that there. But we're often, for example, in states of looking at decolonisation of the university, so we draw to very normative issues around, this space, let's decolonise Bristol, let's change one of the aspects of the Bristol University logos, and I think these symbolisms are really important. But I would say, let's start by decolonising passports. Let's start decolonising the inequalities in visas, and go back to what, in visa access, go back to what was being said earlier in relation to arms trade, war and conflict, and the investments, including through universities, including through Bristol University and the university that I work at as well, the investments by arms trade corporations, which are, even run like postgrad programs, etc. Queen's University has just divested from Israeli, working with the sort of Israeli technologies, etc. If anybody caught that this week, has anybody seen that this week? No? So I think it's the first university to be moving toward full divestment in this era. But if we take a look at this, I think it's from monitoring this over the last 10 years or something, I think it's really interesting to think about where wealth is and how that has shifted, because we number one in the contemporary passport program is now the United Arab Emirates. It is not what most people would expect, which was, actually, the UK has moved down. I'm Irish, so here I'm able to move very freely, and so these numbers here are 126. I can go to 126 countries visa-free. I am probably contemporarily amongst the least people who need to move. We have a leisure class and a need class. When we look through the passport index, when we get to the bottom here, what we can see through these relationships of passport power and visa access is those who are most in need of being able to move globally are those who are least able to. And actually this does draw back to the issue of billionaires and millionaires, because this relates to investment in terms of oil and investment in terms of arms as well. And so what we have is this disparity, it's an interesting infographic in itself, because you can just see the shades which are darkest are those which you are least able to move freely from. So it's a remarkable north-south divide in one very easy picture. So in terms of decolonising, I think, starting with passports, it's always interesting to see Australia, again, being in the global south, but of course so deeply connected historically to the global north. But what we can see here as well, of course, Palestinian territories, Bangladesh, the histories of conflict and contemporary conflict in those who cannot move. And what comes from that is the industries that are built up by the rich, and those by which the shares of organisations and corporations, including, for example, G4S, Serco, Mighty, actually facilitate I would say neo-colonialist confinement of people based on this north-south divide in terms of visa and access. This, I think, I'm not going to spend time to go through it. I didn't make slides on it because I didn't know we were going to end up talking about conflict. But that's actually, so my main area of interest is responses to conflict survivors. So of course this is deeply impactful on people who can't move. What I would also say from the research that I've been doing, particularly the last 10 years in relation to torture responses, is that as borders have become both more militarised and more reliant on externally forcing or restricting visas, so you can't enter countries to, for example, seek asylum, is that torture mushrooms, the capacity to torture mushrooms in these border areas, because the less able that you are to move freely, say through 15 years ago I would meet people who had come to the UK who have maybe flown from Ethiopia or for the Democratic Republic of Congo. These safe routes obviously being diminished means that unsafe routes facilitate more borders that allow for more militarisation and more abuses as people move. So more of the people that I work with, or the psychotraumatologists that I work with, are seeing is abuses across the borders after already fleeing conflict, which itself is deeply embedded in the rich investing in arms trade. So what does that have to do with wealth and billionaires? It brings us back to the role, the new nexus between state and corporations. I don't think anymore we can even just talk about the state, because the state and corporate are so deeply aligned in monetising on the unfreedom of people in relation to these spaces, and in relation to things like the increases in immigration detention. Now I want to go back again to the billionaire aspect, because I'm thinking about, if anybody caught Elon Musk's tweet. What day am I on? It's only Tuesday, right? So yesterday, I think, Elon Musk tweeted as the unrests in LA increased. So people been following the unrests where Marines were seeing that, deep. I think there was 6,000 protesters, 500 Marines set onto the streets to respond to 600 protesters, or 6,000 protesters. So you can do the maths in relation to the extent to which that militarisation facilitates arrest, facilitates abuses, facilitates rights abuses. But all Elon Musk had to do was tweet, this isn't right, or whatever it was that I was reading yesterday on my way down. More than 500,000 people have retweeted or liked this tweet. So actually, I'm concerned that billionaires are more tolerated and more appreciated than we would like to think. I think that, that you have that influence, however daft we might think they are, however, ridiculous at some stages we can even think of Musk to be, is that actually, after many years of normalisation of wealth, normalisation of othering, and normalisation of wanting the reduction and eradication of people who are migrating, for example, the more people are happy to invest, I think, actually, in immigration detention, happy to invest more in militarisation, which ends up in rights violations and the reductions of civil liberties. And these are things that I think we have to confront as academics or researchers or activists, because it changes how we do our work and how we play these games. It's one of the questions we had earlier on with the postgrads was around whether or not people know what they are doing when they implement policies, or are these daft policies? Is there some stupidity or something behind these terms that I'm not keen on? But these are questions, or is there intent? And from a semiological perspective, we know intent is incredibly difficult to evidence, because you have to be able to prove somebody really knew what they were doing. But a lot of things are actually a case of 1 + 1 will very easily equal 2. They're incredibly predictable. And going back to things like looking back at borders, it is incredibly predictable that if you have been in war or conflict in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, that there was always going to be mass movements of people to safety, and that those mass movements of people were going to require humanitarian response. What instead has been done is the deliberate reduction of those mass movements, facilitating increased deaths at borders through the lack of free movement through visas. So more than 35,000 people have died in the Mediterranean alone since 2014. That's not an unpredictable outcome. That's completely predictable if you remove these safe routes. If we change the access, the two-child policy, etc., it's 1 + 1 = 2. My nieces and nephews could come to the conclusion that if you remove the access to free school lunches, that children will go hungry. And that brings me back to the point that's brought up in the next crisis, which is freedom. What is freedom if we have such a disparity between wealth and poverty, and the victims of wealth? And I really like that term, because we often think of poverty as something that just sits separate to the grades in which people get to live their lives, and the disparity of income that people can enjoy or not enjoy. And actually the victims of wealth is what we should be thinking about. And I would also say that those who are held in things like immigration detention are also the victims of wealth. Those who are losing their lives in what would arguably be defined as genocide in Gaza are also the victims of wealth through arms trade, and that is variable facilitations of mass atrocities. So this brings me as well to, I don't want to spend too much longer because I think we're going to have time for further discussion, but it does bring me to what is our role contemporarily, because I do think that these outcomes are more deliberate than we like to accept or that we like to think, because then we have to confront the idea that some people are happy enough, that some people will languish for years in immigration detention, or that people know that people will die at borders but actually don't care about it, or even more, that one of the outcomes, one of the deliberate, results of these decisions is what has been wanted. Not that it's accidental or a byproduct. I've written about this in an article years ago called Degradation by Design. But I think whenever we look at political discourses, when we look at investments in arms trade, even in Liverpool, where I live, I work in Lancaster, but I live in Liverpool, only last summer was the arms fair. It sounds like a nice day out, the arms fair. The discourses around this are not accidental, and so I think us confronting the policies, the legislations that have been developed are not accidental, but in fact embed exactly the objectives of those who are most powerful, and this facilitates expansionism both of arms and of immigration and prison industry complexes. So this brings me to a question which may be more of a question than my answers is, we spend a lot of our time making policy recommendations, and I don't know how many recommendations I've made about immigration detention or housing and asylum housing or responding to survivors of torture or violence. Actually, whenever we start to think that these systems are doing exactly what they're designed to do, then we have to find other questions to ask to make changes, to implement the recommendations that actually might be taken up, rather than just telling somebody something that they know would solve the problem anyway, but that's not the problem that they want to solve because it's already doing its job as it should do. And that, I think, just forces us to confront what is effectively the aspects of humanity that we don't really want to, is that harms are sometimes embedded and not accidental, and how do we then address the billionaires, the millionaires, and states and corporations that are behind these inflictions of endemic harms